right, ladies and gentlemen, we back at it again. Get to take my mask off. Got to be socially distant. All right, so now, first lesson we talked about a juvenile delinquent, what it is, what a person is considered to be, and how they are dealt with differently than adult criminals. Let's talk about due process, about the rights that you are entitled to when you have to go to court. So there are a number of different rights. The one you probably heard of the most is called the right to remain silent. Right? The purpose of that is to keep you from essentially telling on yourself. You have the right to remain silent. That's one of the rights that are afforded to you under the law. You might hear police officers in movies say you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided to you at no cost. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you? That's called a Miranda Warning. Miranda, okay? It's a case that happened in 1966 about a guy named Ernesto Miranda. I'll get to that a little bit later in the class, all right? I don't want you to get confused now, okay? Because some people are led to believe you have a misnomer that every time a police officer places somebody into custody, they have to be Mirandized. That's not true. In my whole career as a law enforcement officer, I have effected over 200 arrests. Over 200. Never once have I Mirandized anybody. How's that possible, AC? Well, the purpose of Mirandizing a person that I'm placing into custody is to remind them you have the right to remain silent. I'm reminding you, when I lock you up, you don't have to talk to me. You don't have to tell me nothing. In most courts, I don't want you to tell me nothing. There will be times that people will be, taken into custody, and then they want to start telling you, listen, I don't want you to explain it to me. Why? Because I am not going to ask them questions that could incriminate them or put them in a position where they're telling on themselves. Right? All I'm doing is I'm arresting you, taking you into custody. I'm taking you to another officer, and that officer is going to interrogate you. He's going to ask you questions. He's going to interview you. But before he can interview you, he has to Mirandize you. He has to remind you, look, my name is AC Moseley. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions now. But before I ask you these questions, I got to remind you, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford an attorney, one will be provided to you at no cost. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you? Right? That's another part of due process. First, the right to remain silent. And along with that right to remain silent comes in that Miranda warning for that police officer who's going to ask you questions that can incriminate you. Right? Now, along with this due process, you got the right to a speedy trial, the right to face your accuser, the right to be informed of the cause and nature of the charges against you. So when you're being arrested, you have the right to ask, why are you arresting me? What is the cause and nature of these charges? Why are you arresting me? You have the right to know that. That's based on due process. You are entitled to a public trial. You're entitled to a fair and impartial jury. right? So for instance, if I'm a New York Giants fan, diehard New York Giants fan, they can't have a jury full of people that are Jets fans or Cowboys fans, Mr. Harris. You're entitled to have a fair jury, a group of people that are not going to sit there and let their biases or prejudices affect how they listen to the evidence against you. Right? Okay. You have, most importantly, the right to face your accuser. Somebody wants to accuse you of a crime, okay? They have to come to court and they have to give your defense attorney the opportunity to question them, to see if they're reliable, credible. We'll talk about those words a little bit later, right? The due process that's afforded to you, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. You have the right to have somebody who is a professional when it comes to the legal system, defending your rights, right? You have the right to a fair and impartial jury. You have the right to a speedy trial. You have the right to a public trial. All of these rights that we're talking about fall under due process. If you are a citizen in the United States, you are entitled to due process, right? Due process, again, for the sake of, so let's go back. Due process is all the rights that you are entitled to when you're dealing with the judicial system, court, trial, things of that nature, right? So now we're going to tie this lesson in particular, due process, to lesson 1. We're going to go back to lesson 1 for a second. I told you before in lesson 1, the juvenile court system is designed to rehabilitate juvenile delinquents and not punish them, right? Now, that's a great thing. That's a great win for juveniles in particular. But at one point in time, juveniles were not entitled to all of the constitutional rights that adults were entitled to. I'm going to tell you a story. I hope you like the first story I told you. I'm going to tell you another story. All right? This story took place in 1967 with a young man by the name of Gerald Galt. Okay? So famous what happened to him, he had a Supreme Court case law named after him. Galt 187-1 in the U.S. statute. So let me tell you about Gerald Galt. Gerald Galt was a 15-year-old juvenile delinquent. He had gotten into trouble numerous times. Okay. On one particular day, Gerald was accused of making an indecent phone call to his neighbor. Right? Indecent. He's on the phone, allegedly, he's on the phone, allegedly using profanity. Right? Now you got to understand, this is 1967. You know, there was no call ID. There was no star 69. There was none of that. Allegedly, somebody made a phone call from Gerald's house to his next door neighbor. That was an indecent phone call. So this particular neighbor has been dealing with Gerald. Gerald has vandalized things around his home. He's done all kinds of crazy, ridiculous things. So finally, his neighbor has had enough. She knows that beyond question, it was Gerald, even though she couldn't prove it. So what does she do? She calls the sheriff. She makes the complaint. About an hour after she makes the complaint, sheriff comes to Gerald's house and places him under arrest. They take Gerald to the police station. They photograph, fingerprint Gerald, keep him in custody. Gerald's mother comes home from work. She doesn't find him. Okay. She goes out looking for her son. She can't find her son. The lady's going crazy. Right? Days have passed. She can't find her son. So finally it occurs to her, let me go down to the sheriff's office and put in a missing persons complaint for my son. Because it's not like him to just get up and leave. Goes down to the sheriff's station to file a complaint. And they find out that Gerald's there. Mother didn't know. Nobody made her aware of the fact that he'd been placed in custody. They get notice that the next day Gerald has a court date, a hearing in front of a judge. And it's determined then that his charge carried a punishment if Gerald was an adult. Now, mind you, Gerald's 15 years old. Had Gerald been an adult, the stiffest penalty that the judge could have inflicted on him was a $50 fine and 2 months in prison. 2 months. If he was an adult. Gerald's 15. The judge comes to court. The judge decides on his own. He is going to remand or put Gerald in a reform school until he turns 21. Now, if I told you he was 15 and I just told you the judge is not going to allow him to leave this reform school until he's 21, how long is that in prison? 6 years. I want to be clear when I say this so there's no misunderstanding. Had Gerald been an adult, the stiffest penalty he could have faced would have been a $50 fine and 2 months in prison. Here, him being 15 years old and the judge taking it upon himself to punish him for acts that he allegedly committed years ago in his youth, the judge decided he was going to teach him a lesson and he was going to send him to reform school until he turned 21 years old. Now, Gerald's mother decided that she was going to take this case all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. And when they reviewed his case, they said a couple of things that were interesting. They said, one, even though Gerald is a juvenile, he was still entitled to the same due process. He was entitled to know that he didn't have to speak to police. He was entitled to be warned that he was due an attorney, a lawyer. He was entitled to know the cause and nature of the crime against him. Why was he being arrested? He was entitled to have his parents immediately notified. Didn't happen. Now, when you study these particular cases in the case law and all that stuff, you'll understand that these cases take a long time to be litigated. So, unfortunately, Gerald spent the majority of that time in this reform school. Now, luckily for him, they being the Supreme Court, they overturned his conviction. Why are we making this connection between due process and Gerald Galt? Why is that? Why is there a connection there? Regardless whether you are a juvenile or an adult, you are entitled to the same due process, the same right to remain silent, the same right to an attorney, the same right to a speedy trial. The same right to a public trial. The same right to face your accusers. I want to go back in this because I left something out that's very important. When Gerald went to court, the next door neighbor that filed the complaint against him in the first place, saying it was him making these indecent phone calls, she never came to identify him. She never came to testify against him. So essentially, here you have this young man who is what? What would you consider Gerald Galt to be? Give me a word for that. Exactly. He would be a juvenile delinquent. Very good. So now, if he is a juvenile delinquent, the person who filed the complaint against him didn't even come to court. Now, again, we go back. This is 1967. This is not, they don't have star 69. They don't have caller ID. So here, whether he committed this crime or not, there was no tangible evidence to convict him. The Supreme Court said Gerald Galt's due process was violated. Now, if you take nothing away from lesson 2, I want you to understand, even though you are a juvenile, even though you are between the ages of 10 and 17 years old, you are still entitled to due process. Right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, the right to a speedy trial, the right to a fair and impartial jury, the right to face your accuser, the right to have cause and knowledge of the charges against you, right? So we're going to put these two lessons together, and I'm going to come back to you with lesson 3, right? Lesson 3, we're going to talk about, I could foreshadow a little bit. Lesson 3, we're going to talk about the arrest standards, all the things that have to happen to a juvenile when he's placed into custody. All right? So far, we've covered the history of juvenile law, and we've covered due process. All right? So the next lesson is juvenile arrest standards. All right? See you guys later.